Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring less insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode we're going to discuss outwintering on forage crops. I'm joined by Teagasc advisor James Doran and Better Farm participant John Doyle. John is farmer outside Ballindaggan in County Wexford. He's running a tillage and dry stock enterprise. John has been outwintering on forage crops on an annual basis for a long number of years. We start off with James explaining the potential yield of the different crops and how they fit into the system. James outlines key management tips when grazing these crops, especially to avoid digestive upsets and other potential health issues. He also highlights potential issues around clean livestock policy and what remedial actions can be taken.
They're a very important crop in the southeast, Ciarán, particularly in the last number of years. We've probably seen a bit of a step away, if you like, from traditional root crops down here, maybe fodder beets and things like that, and farmers traditionally grazing fodder beet tops, to maybe more brassicas, the likes of fodder rape and kale and hybrid type crops. A lot of that, I suppose, being driven by schemes to a certain extent, where GLAS schemes are requiring farmers to sow these crops, but also, guys are putting them in there to carry a good number of sheep, be it breeding ewes or store lamb enterprises over autumn and winter periods there, and are working quite well in a lot of cases.
It's interesting you coming on that shift. Traditionally that would have been a really strong area for root crops, and you have seen it gradually creep in more and more over the last number of years. The change away to maybe more of these brassicas, or certainly the hybrid brassicas, going in over the last couple of seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. The hybrid brassicas seem to be quite good. So typically they're what guys are putting in, and it seems to safeguard a reasonable yield as well. Are those, you'll be familiar with product names like Red Start and Interval, which are kind of the most commonplace on the market there. And they were basically a kale rape hybrid, and they seem to give quite a good yield and tick the box there for guys that are sowing crops relatively early.
James, that kind of leads us into the next bit of, and you've touched on a bit of already, the potential of these crops over the winter and for different types of animals. Like, obviously there's a lot of factors in it, and depends on the crop that goes in, but maybe you'll just give us a little bit of an insight into what kind of carrying capacities and the nutritional value of some of these crops are.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the early establishment of it, as well, and you touched on it there yourself, is very, very important. And we might come back to that there later on as well. But that's a huge factor in terms of the carrying capacities, because crops that are sown, I suppose, generally after winter cereals in, say, early August time typically, or maybe into a lay field that's earmarked for reseeding the following year, which happens as well, will give you, a very good crop. Whereas something that's sown early to mid-September, just to take a box for a scheme, typically will be very, very poor in terms of capacities. But just some general ideas there in terms of what you could expect. I mean, an earlier sown crop, we'll call that 1st of August, is capable of growing about 4 or 5 tons of dry matter per hectare. So that's, I suppose, in a practical sense, that's something that's about hip height, and that should carry about 180 lambs per acre per week, store lambs, or about 140 ewes per acre per week. I suppose when we're doing our sums with farmers, we're working on the basis of 12% dry matter in those crops typically, and about 75% utilization. And the utilization figure can be higher, and quite often it can be lower depending on weather. And I suppose just a couple of other quick examples there as well. If you take that crop that's sown then around the 15th of August, generally speaking, that's going to hit around 2 or 3 tons of dry matter per hectare, which is somewhere just around knee height or just below the knee if you're walking the crop. That'll carry about 90 store lambs per acre per week, or maybe about 70 ewes. And then I suppose the final example then is something that's sown for scheme purposes there around the 1st of September. You're looking at probably close to a ton of dry matter per hectare on that, if even. And that's probably something that's up to your ankle height, I suppose, really, if you're trying to visualize it. And that's going to carry about 40 lambs per acre per week, and maybe about 30 ewes per acre per week. So the weather has a huge bearing on that, in terms of utilization and in terms of thrive, obviously, but they're just some typical figures for you.
I think that's where I'm going to come to you with you next. Like, the challenges, it's a crop you have to actively manage, but I suppose the first challenge, and you've touched on some of it there, the sowing date obviously has a huge impact on yield. And look, we can argue, certainly over the last couple of summers, we've had different problems crop up with it, but even the conditions that are prevailing during the time of sowing and establishment have a big impact. Like from your own perspective and from your clients in there, where does the big issue come in? Or maybe you just can allude to where the big issues come in for sowing date, the impact of it.
Yeah, so I mean, the sowing date is huge. I mean, and literally every day you would see it in crops. Every day matters. You know, a crop that's sown on the 1st of September versus the 5th of September, even you would see a difference in it. And look, even more marked so in those crops that are sown in August. So it's hugely important. What we would have seen anecdotally this year as well is that crops that were sown in August, in comparison to other years, their yields maybe not as good on them, and maybe where similar amounts of nitrogen were put out, the crops seem to have more growing capacity this year, whether it was weather related or whatever, but the crop seemed to just run out of power, and a lot of yellowing on leaves in some cases appearing there. So, you'd find that kind of variation different years. I go back to 2018 when we had the drought year. There was a huge spurt of growth, if you like, there later on in the back end of the year, and there seemed to be a massive release of nitrogen in the ground, and it seemed to carry a lot of those crops nearly with very little fertilizer. So there is that variation year in, year out, but the sowing date is huge in terms of getting that crop initially there, and then I suppose management from there then is another problem. You touched on that there as well.
Yeah, like it's probably the one, James, is in focus at the moment. Like, your yield is determined up by the sowing date, and that has a big impact on what you're going to do with the sheep for the rest of the year. But even at the moment, the utilisation of that crop and the prevailing weather conditions, certainly this winter, will have put that in the focus. That's going to have another big knock-on effect on how much you get out of it and the kind of performance on the crops as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there would be even in trial work there over the years. I mean, you can get in ferociously extreme scenarios, utilizations as low as 20 and 30%. Now, look, that could be for a short period maybe or whatever, but you can see utilizations well below that 75%, and obviously that's going to knock your carrying capacity or your days ahead of you. So I suppose you're trying to manage it as best you can. You're trying to allocate relatively small blocks at a time. I suppose that that sheep are not going to walk a lot of this crop if the weather does get very wet on you, and trying to utilize it as best you can. So I would say, you certainly wouldn't want to be allocating any more than a week's grazing ahead. And in an ideal world, you're probably looking at 2 to 3 days per shift, I suppose, on the wires. And I know that's extra work, but certainly in trickier weather scenarios, you will get the benefit from it.
There's a bit of a balancing act there to get right. Like, I'm just thinking, James, the other challenges with that crop, even some of the health aspects, some of the cleanliness aspects that crop up with the various crops. What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, so a couple of health management issues there. Those crops, which are brassica based, obviously typically contain goitrogens, which inhibit the uptake of iodine when sheep are grazing. So for longer keep stock, store lambs that are going to be kept around until next spring, or ewes that are going to be breeding ewes that are going to be there for a while as well, absolutely they will want to be treated with an iodine based product. So be that a mineral bolus or maybe a bucket, plenty of access to buckets in the field, or a dose or whatever. But that is important, certainly. Other aspects in management issues.
I'm just thinking, like, from the other thing, and it ties in there with utilisation, particularly wet winter. And we're seeing a lot of store lambs come off these crops now, and it has bearing for ewes as well. It's the cleanliness coming off the crops. The whole idea of getting belly clipped beforehand,
yeah,
and trying to provide that dry lie.
Absolutely, that's starting to become a huge issue now with the current weather that we're having, and there's more and more animals being presented into abattoirs now for slaughter that are finding issue with the clean livestock policy and that. So it is a problem, and I suppose it's difficult for those farmers out there who are moving lambs for slaughter directly off those fodder crops, to have them into a category that they can be killed straight away. So you're trying to manage that as best you can. You're trying to ensure that maybe sheep have a dry spot to lie down, be that ideally in a grass lie-back scenario, or maybe there's just a dry area that's eaten in the field first that they can lie back onto there. If you're doing supplementary feeding in the field, you're moving those trucks as regularly as possible to try and avoid a build-up of material there. And look, ideally crutching or dagging lambs as well is the ideal scenario, but that's not always possible going into the crop, even if it can be done, crutching and have them clean and avoid any kind of a major build-up of dirty fleeces while they're grazing the crop.
Just like when we're talking about weather-related issues, and this is really coming into focus of these crops, because you're subject to it at all times of the year, from sowing to actually using it. We haven't seen many frosty mornings, so we haven't this year so far, but we're certainly going to see them before we're finished with it. The challenge of managing some of these crops in more adverse weather, it does require a little bit of a different skill set.
It does, and it takes a little bit of a step back maybe when you walk out that morning to move your wire and you see the crop is very visibly frosted over. Well, it is dangerous, I suppose, to be feeding those kind of crops to animals at that stage. So I would suggest that just a very simple tool there is possibly wait to move the wire until maybe midday or afternoon, until the sun has come out. The crop is now defrosted, if you like, and then the animals can get going again. Like, you have to remember, these crops are highly palatable and highly digestible, so they will eat them and can get issues then with digestive upsets and acidosis. So while they're great crops and they're very, very high in energy and protein, they tick a lot of boxes for Thrive. It's just to be very, very careful. And I suppose I should have mentioned that at the start as well, to be careful when you are initially letting the sheep into those crops, that it's a gradual intake. I would always say to farmers and clients down here that it's nearly like letting sheep into a meal shed. It's so palatable, it's so high in energy. So you're kind of letting them in slowly, letting them in 2 or 3 hours the first day, letting them back out, getting them adjusted, and over the period of the first 3 or 4 days, then they should be fine.
The acclimatization period. It probably brings something else up, just James, like having the backup plan there for if the crop starts to run out too early or we do hit that really bad weather period, to be able to provide the backup forage or backup supplement. It's not always a case of this is just going to tick every box for us.
Yeah, this is it, and I suppose that's what we're finding this year because of the weather, and maybe those crops are not as good as what we would have liked. That we're not getting the same value out of them. So, yeah, I mean, that requires supplementation then, whether that's meal feeding or whether it's providing a fodder source in the field as well to try and stretch that crop out for you. And look, that has to be factored in, and how that works then, and and is that easily done? Because is there labour available to do that, and is it going to be handily done rather than trying to walk across fields with bags of meal and all this kind of carry on. So it's trying to make life easy as well as everything else, but that has to be factored in, absolutely, and trying to stretch the crop to whatever your preferred sale date is. Yeah.
And then practical aspects of actually delivering that at the time. Just Dave, like maybe to finally finish up, and I know we're going to catch up with one of your clients, John Doyle, later on the podcast, but the role of these crops in the area, like we see a little bit of sharing between livestock and tillage farmers. It's working into rotations, and even in certain cases, there's grass layers going back in for reseeds, being put in the crops during the winter. It has an important function in that area.
It does, yeah. It's huge, like in that sense. It's intertwines really well with a lot of the farms down here, because they would have kind of a tillage enterprise already on the farm. So it kind of makes sense to be utilizing that ground and putting in the fodder crop there to avail that for the sheep for the winter period. Oftentimes a lot of farmers would work with a neighboring dairy or tillage farmer there as well to establish those crops for them, and they're working together, and those relationships have been built up there for the last number of years and are working quite well. So yeah, it's very important that way. It's also a help, I suppose, the dairy or the tillage farmers. I keep saying dairy farmers. These tillage farmers also get, I suppose, a kick on their yield as well in terms of the crop for the following year. So it suits their enterprise from that sense, as well as building up organic matter in the soil, and it's giving an extra nitrogen release there to those tillage crops the following year. So yeah, look, it ticks a lot of boxes, absolutely.
It's mutually beneficial in most cases. James, it was great catching up with you. Thanks for coming on with us today.
No problem, Ciarán.
So for the second half of this, we're going to swap over to John Doyle. And we start off with John, giving a bit of a description of the role of forage crops on his farm and how it has changed over the last number of years.
We were always sowing beet here, and then when the beet went, we had nowhere to carry the ewes during the winter time. We were so used to beet tops, and we were spoiled really. And then we just automatically, we said we'd grow some turnips. So then the turnips worked out well. They kept the ewes out during the winter, and they just come in 2 weeks pre-lambing. So it worked well, wood silage. Then glass come on the scene, and we went sowing forage crops in July, August. July, August is kind of the right months. Late July, early August is probably the proper time, and so we'd have the crops then coming on in, on the glass crops wouldn't get to be eaten until December, but we'd have some extra stuff sowed on stubbles that would be left over after the glass, and we'd use those from the end of October onwards, when the ewes will be coming off the grass, to let the grass grow for the next following year. So it worked very well because we had our own tillage, our own machines and stuff, and so the cost was only seed and some manure. So but we were manuring our own land back again and kind of riching up the land, I thought, with the sheep travelling on it. Anywhere you have sheep, you have manure the whole time. So little mini spinners, we call them down here.
So it was helping the tillage system as well on the farm.
Yeah, it would do. Yeah, it was kind of, you were getting the glass money and you were carrying the ewes through the winter, and you were, but you need to get the crops sowed in end of July, 1st of August to get the yield. On the years that we don't get sowed, like this year, until end of August, 1st September, the yield halves, so you don't get as much value of it. But man, that's the year. You can't do nothing about that. Like, so you go with the year. Some years you win like everything, and some years it's not so good. But on the whole, like over say a 10-year period, it works out good on this farm anyway.
It's just one of the challenges you mentioned when we're talking to James Doran earlier. Like, that sowing date for the crop is so vital. This year, John, you didn't get going in as early as you would have liked.
No, the crop. Well, the weather stopped us from cutting the crop, and then the minute the corn was got, it was only grabbed. And you cut corn this evening. It rained for 2 days. The straw was on the land for 2 weeks or a week and a half. So we had to get that off and get it sowed. So it was almost September again. We got most of it sowed. The proper time is to sow it in winter barley, but we haven't sowed winter barley for the last few years. But if you get winter barley and you're cutting the 21st of July, then you're in the 25th of July. And again, the 25th of September, you have a crop growing, or the 25th of August, you have a crop growing, whereas this year we were only starting to cut or sow, we're only starting to sow a month. So a month in July and August it's actually worth 2 months in September. So but you can't do anything about that. If you have winter crops, it works better. If you get the spring crops sowed early, cut middle and early, and the weather suits you, it works great too.
You can gain that extra bit of yield. Look, for this year, you have turnips in again this year. You have forage rape in as well, have you?
I have, yeah. I have turnips, 3 acres of turnips in. They worked well this year. They're working well. A good crop. Some years you don't get a good crop of those either. There's different things,
And the ewes are on it at the moment, are they, John?
The turnips at the moment, yeah. The forage rape is all eaten because it wasn't as good this year, but it's it is what it is. You might have to put in the ewes maybe 3 weeks or a month earlier, but we usually only put them in 2 weeks before lambing. But this year they probably have to go in a few weeks earlier because the yield wasn't there. But maybe next year it'll be different. So that's the way it works.
You have to manage what's in front of you. John, just take us through the actual management for a minute. You're green after mating. Obviously, you're transitioning them in on it with their own back on the first block or two. How often are you moving the splits in the various crops, whether it be the turnips or the forage rape?
Well, sure, on the rape, which depends on the yield, but usually we give them 3 acres and there'd be 4 days or something like that on it, or it could be 6 days. It depends on the yield. And we keep moving them, and we put in, with the ewes especially, we put in silage just to make sure they had some silage with them, and mineral licks and water, and just keep moving them when they'd have it eaten off. It's usually once a week anyway, or 5 days or 4 days, depends on the yield. But the turnips, you get longer out of the turnips because you have more yield in the turnips. You could get a week and a half, or depends on how much you give them, but around the week we try to keep them moving into new ground fairly often, but we try to take the workload off, not changing the wire too often, kind of mix it in the middle.
Getting that balance a bit between it.
Yeah.
like you mentioned, just the other end of it, and I know you're in a wee bit earlier this year because of the yield, but you'd have probably went in quite close to lamb and transition them off that day. Like you're providing silage. Are you starting feeding them meal out on the crop as well?
Oh yeah, the fed meal as normal, like 6 weeks out from lambing, they'll be getting barley and soya hulls. That's what our mix was, barley and soya hulls. And then on 3 weeks out they'll be getting soybean meal, and then they'll be on a full mix. They'll be nearly getting their full core when they'll be going in at 2 weeks. There'll be nothing changing. They'll be getting the barley nearly up to the full rate, or the feed up to the full rate. And they'd be getting all the silage they could eat along with the turnips or rape, whichever it be, and it just automatically go into the house then, and they'd be still on the meal and the silage. The only change would be they'd be coming off the rape or the turnips, but it doesn't seem to matter. 2 weeks out, 2.5 weeks out, it works fine. We never have any problems anyway. Some people say coming off turnips to get a bigger lamb, but you don't really. If you're feeding them meal at the right rates, and you don't really. So I don't see any difference. Never did.
Even the kind of transition before they're coming in anyway.
Oh yeah, you don't just drop take them straight off turnips and put them on a feed that they're not used to. You just have them kind of used to everything before they go in. So there's no change, only the shed really.
And just like you've grazed. I know last year you had lambs on forage rape as well. Like you've used it a little bit for lambs over the last couple of years. I know your focus is mainly on the ewes, but how's it worked out for you for the lambs in the back end of the year?
Yeah, sure. It works good. Any year it's good. It's good, but we feed some meal with that as well, just to finish them off. But yeah, most of them would fatten them. Most of them would kill off it. There is the few you have to bring in and maybe put in the shed for 6 weeks maybe and feed them meal, but the majority of them, 80% of them, finishes off on the rape anyway. So it works good, and it keeps them out, and it's less work with them.
Just
less
John,
foot problems.
I'm thinking the wet conditions we have. I know in the sunny southeast, which you'll often tell me is the different conditions, but keeping them clean and managing that cleanliness coming in for both for the ewes and the lambs. Any issues with that for you over the last couple of years?
For the ewes and the turnips, sometimes it can get quite mucky, on turnips because the field is ploughed and tilled as normal. But on a coming off, direct drilling into tillage land, it doesn't seem to get that mucky. There is it depends on the land too. But if you're on high ground, kind of shingly tillage ground that we have here, most of it is okay. The odd wet field, yeah, you will have some, but we never have any problems in the factory really. We often sell off the field, if they were wet, like a wet time, we might bring them in for a night or something like that before we sell them. But generally, we don't have that much work with them really.
It has worked well for you, and I suppose your key thing on that is the yield is very much determined by how quick you can get in sown it in the back end.
The sowing date is it's 90% of the problem. Like if you get the sowing date in, I know we sowed rape here one particular year, the 21st of July, and so we had over knee high up to the waist nearly. In my case, up to my waist, and but I'm short, but up to the waist, And whereas the next year then, or that particular year, we sowed more in end of August, the 1st of September, and sure wouldn't be even up. Wouldn't get up halfway up your shins. It wouldn't be, 8-10 inches. But that's the difference in 3 weeks growth. Like the 3 weeks at the right time. There's an awful difference, twice the difference actually.
John, always good getting your insights on these things. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to finish things up at this point. Again, good catching up with both James and John, getting their views and experience on forage crops and the potential they have on farms. It was interesting to get their insights on how the potential benefits are there for both the livestock and tillage enterprise on the farm, but clearly it requires good levels of management. John described it very in there again, the impact sowing date and what the conditions can have on your potential crop yield. That's it for me. Again, for any other updates on the sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our podcasts.